Remember what I said above. We got some big business to talk about this week. Arguably, the number two pay-per-view seller towards the end of his career in the UFC was Jorge Masvidal. He also dropped a bomb on us yesterday. Heck, we had to reshuffle this script here that I'm going off. He's unretired, according to his post on X, formerly Twitter. That's it. That's all he X'd or tweeted or whatever. Unretired. Okay. So, what are you all thinking? We turn to Goes for the first guess. What do you think, Goes? Where's this guy headed? What's he going to do?
Well, this is great news. I think this is going to be fun. Jorge Masvidal is a guy that does absolutely move the needles. Like if you look at the pay-per-view numbers, or you look at how many people tune in, the guy is just magic. So I think going forward, it's got to be all about fun fights. Though he said himself, he's just that upper echelon. He's probably not going to hang there. So you got to make things that are fun. We have to figure out what the UFC's strategy would be if that's where it is that he's going to fight. How are you going to use him? Are you going to use him to build up younger fighters? I don't think that's a good idea. And the only thing I could maybe think of is like maybe like if you're doing it to a guy like Ian Gary, where you could create some kind of heat or something like that. I could see that, but I don't think feeding him to younger fighters works. I don't think getting a guy like a Matt Brown or someone like that, like that's just not Masvidal. That's not what we tune in for. I think it's got to be something maybe along the lines of the rematch with Nate Diaz, those types of names that generate a lot of money. But you know what? Honestly, had it not been for what happened with Michael Chandler on Tough and Conor McGregor, I think Conor McGregor's always been a name that we've all kind of wondered what would it be like if those two fought. If I am Jorge Masvidal, that is the name that I continuously try and attach myself to. Try and get that big fight. I think that would be absolutely huge. I think it would be a fun fight. But as far as a strategy with Jorge Masvidal, fun fights, big names. That's what you got to do with them.
Instinct in the chat says Jorge versus Tony. Let's see here. JC Miller says Masvidal versus Askren 2. Make it happen. And 1 foot out the door. All right, man. Fist bump to you. He says, hit the thumbs up, folks. That's right. Give us a like. This show still has about another half hour to go. All right, Ghost. I like that you set the table. Next up is Danny. What are your thoughts, man? Where's Game Bread headed?
Honestly, I don't mind seeing him back. Most people that unretire, I'm always like, not always, but 90% of the time, I'm like, oh my God, why? In this case with Masvidal, like against Burns, he looked pretty good. And again, that was a Burns that was at a really, really good moment. That's a Burns that's easily a top 5 contender. And he looked all right. He looked all right. Is he the fighter that he once was? No, I do think we've seen better days from Jorge Masvidal. I do think that he is at a decline, but not steep enough to the point where, he is a Bigfoot Silva where we're begging him to retire, or a Tony Ferguson. I do believe that Masvidal right now, probably top 15 fighter still at welterweight, top 10. I don't know, but top 15, maybe, certainly top 20 at the very least. So I think there are some good fights for him still out there. We see right now some highlights, or we were watching some highlights of the Nate Diaz fight. I think a rematch would make sense. I think a fight with McGregor still, I can't believe that's a fight that for whatever reason it didn't materialize and didn't build enough steam. I think that's a perfect fight for both guys. No wrestling, just striking, about the same size. Obviously McGregor is the A side, but probably Masvidal is the strongest B side you can get nowadays in the UFC, bigger than even Chandler if you're talking about pay-per-view buys. So throw in there Bobby Green. I think there are some good names for him. Heck, even Leon Edwards. I think right now Leon Edwards as champion, it doesn't make sense. But again, if he were to lose as a bounce back fight for Leon Edwards and as a big money fight for Masvidal, why not? And Masvidal beats Leon Edwards, who was just the former champ. I don't know. Maybe he can get himself back in the title contention. Who knows? But there are plenty of fights out there for Masvidal, and he's a businessman, so he knows that. A lot of fighters just talk a lot of smack about I'm retiring and teasing this and that. I actually hope this one sticks. I would like to see Masvidal back. When he's fighting, the sport's a bit more exciting. And again, as he said, there's plenty of fights for him at 170 pounds, and he's still a quality fighter.
1 foot out the door says Masvidal versus Felder at 170. We know Felder's teased a comeback fight in the past. Others are just telling him, stay retired, man. Joey's saying you're old, you're tired, stay retired, George. Mike Bond, how about you, man? What you got for us on this one?
Yeah, I guess I mean some of these ideas I don't hate. Like a Felder one kind of makes sense. That's similar guys, similar trajectories at this point where they're at, retired, unretired, all that stuff. It just really depends on what direction Jorge wants to go. And as I alluded to in the last segment, like he has not really expressed interest in continuing with mixed martial arts. And in terms of like competing at the top level, he seemed to be pretty open about his skills. Maybe that was just like a moment where he was a little down. He was in kind of the post retirement slump mentally and all that stuff. But you just kind of follow along with what he's been saying over the past like half a year or so. He said he wants to box and that like he's still under UFC contract, but maybe they would let him out or maybe give him some options. And I don't know how many people were paying attention last night because it came and went pretty quickly. But after he tweeted this out, we saw one Jake Paul respond to him and then delete the tweet shortly after saying, yeah, we know you're boxing Nate Diaz next. Let me know when, Dana White lets you out of your contract and we can set something up. And there is, from everything I'm hearing, some truth to that. I don't know if it's going to be done, but it's definitely something that is being discussed. Jorge Masvidal and Nate Diaz in a boxing match for the first quarter of next year. Still a lot of hiccups, a lot of details that would need to be sorted out. If you're Masvidal, why would you not be all in on doing that? That would seems like all upside for you. You've already beat Nate. You get to compete again. You get to box, which you like to do. If that all works out, it's just a question of, is Nate Diaz as invested in doing something like that? When I kind of look at it from the, 1,000 feet above or whatever you want to call it, it doesn't really make as much sense for Nate Diaz to do this. Especially if it was maybe tied to the UFC somehow, but we'll see what plays out. But that to me, from kind of what I've been hearing, is something that is on the table or at least being discussed. So we'll see how it plays out going forward, but something to monitor for sure. And as kind of the timeline adds up here, that seems to make the most sense to me. I just don't really see Masvidal coming back and taking any old fight in the welterweight division. So I would keep my eye more so on that side of it going forward.
Mike, where would they box? Did I miss it? If it were to happen, I mean, I know it's all.
I mean, those are things that I think are still way down the line. Like, do you mean in terms of location or weight or
because I guess
what?
And who is going to get that resistance from the UFC? Because those contracts, even though you retire, unless they've actually let you go, you're still
UFC, I assume, just like anyone else who wants to compete in jiu-jitsu or anything like that, they need to give the thumbs up if they're still under contract. So those are all things, but you look at it, obviously Nate has his Real Fight Inc. company, Masvidal has Game Bread. So like there is little things that go on here. Maybe it's a collaboration between all three. It's still early stages, but we shall see what happens here. But this is all kind of adding up from things I've been hearing, and now Masvidal saying this. So we'll see what happens.
I'd be surprised if the UFC gave him permission, right, to box Nate Diaz. I can maybe see some other people, but Nate Diaz, that's a doable fight that could happen in the UFC. Like, I would think that the UFC would somehow try to sway both fighters to make it happen in the octagon, because that's a big money fight. And that's a way for them, kind of like a shortcut, a cheat code for them to continue their UFC rivalries that the UFC helped build up. But, obviously pocket a lot more money since they're not using the UFC as promoter.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of moving parts too. Like, does Nate want to come back and sign? You assume they would want him for a multi-term deal, but if they say, hey, if you win this one, you get the winner of Conor and Chandler, or Conor, regardless of what happens. There's a lot of things I guess they could do, but I guess too, if the UFC was involved, given their relationship with Masvidal, and they said, if you want to do this, we need to get something on this. Maybe that convinces them and they feel it's viable enough. But again, we will see. Definitely a story to monitor going forward here. And of course, we'll report on it as best we can as things evolve.
Let me ask you guys this. It's just coming to mind. It sounds a little bit silly, but hear me out. So we're talking about Masvidal on retiring, at least according to X, right? We'll see if it actually does happen. If he does return to the UFC, could we potentially see a rematch and maybe even a trilogy with Covington? I mean, I said hell no after they fought, but seeing how bad Covington looked against Edwards, because let's be honest, he didn't look great. I used to not give Masvidal any chance at all, given how the first fight between the two went. But at this state, maybe Covington has had an even sharper decline. I don't know. Maybe that fight is a little bit more competitive in my eyes right now.
Yeah, I mean that would give, I guess, some leeway to maybe like see where Masvidal's at. But yeah, if you lose that one again, I don't know. Like, and I'm sure Colby, knowing the type of guy he is, right? He
I
probably
mean,
just loves it, makes him so happy that he has that over Masvidal at this point. He probably wants to sit on that win for the rest of his life, and he probably doesn't see much upside to beating him again once he already did.
look, it'd be a trilogy. Technically, they're 1-1. Let's not forget what happened at Papi's Steakhouse.
Poppy
That's
Yeah.
true.
Steakhouse.
Very true.
In the chat, Mo Fresh is saying, I'm calling it now. 300 will have the BMF involved. Well, there's two. There's Gaethje and there's Masvidal. So I'm not sure. I mean, we're talking about Masvidal, and I think Gaethje is picking up some steam towards the Makhachev.
I
Challenging
think that's
that.
where it's headed right now, but we'll see.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, that's what's cool about this is there's so many different directions in which to go. The last thing I'll say is this. Man, the UFC teased it a long time ago. Zuffa boxing, get in the game, UFC, if you're gonna do it, and that way you can have a part of this. I feel like if the UFC is involved, both Nate and his promotion, Masvidal and his promotion, the UFC Fight Pass, and the UFC Endeavor, TKO, whatever the F they're called at this point, they can all make more money. Dana says there's just stuff that he doesn't want to mess with, and then all of a sudden, he'll wear a T-shirt or say something. But I really feel like if I think when they get older, the last thing they want to do is wrestle and do jiu-jitsu. The body just doesn't hold up. But if they just can throw hands and make twice as much, 3 times as much, that's what they want at this point, in my opinion.
The problem there is that if the UFC were to get into boxing, boxing has certain laws and rules that would obligate them to operate differently than what they do in mixed martial arts. And the whole point for these fighters to fight out their contract and go do boxing is so they can make bigger money. Sure, the UFC would absolutely make a fight between those two huge, given how good they are at promoting, but that's the whole point. You don't want a middleman so you can cut a check to them. You want to pocket as much money as possible. So I get it. It sounds good, like Sufa boxing and all that, but at the same time, that's what they're trying to get away from. These
Well,
fighters,
I'm
right?
looking at it the more as just entertainment, like what we've been seeing, with Triller and the Jake Paul stuff and the YouTube stuff, not necessarily as like sanctioning bodies or whatever, but what do I know, man?
That's where they would run into problems, is those top level fighters, like the arguments that we're having with Bilal Muhammad. We wouldn't be having them. The governing bodies would say you gotta fight for a title next, and I think that's what Danny means, is like the UFC just doesn't like to play that game where they're being told what needs to happen next. But I understand what you're saying, George. The money isn't necessarily at the top for them. It's more kind of like these mid-level cards that you could put together, these little rivalry fights that don't mean anything as far as belts, but people just want to see other people get smacked.